In this video, we're going to be covering installation of the mpower interior light bar into a 2021 Ford F250. Let's start by opening up the passenger front door. And what we're going to do is we're going to remove the lower sill cover or the rocker cover using a panel tool. And there's a couple clips that are going to release once you get the panel tool under there. Now, once that's been removed, we're going to go ahead and take this kick panel off as well. And a lot of times this is made a lot easier if you move the weather stripping out of the way. But in most cases, you can remove this panel just by pulling on it with your hands, although sometimes a panel tool will come in and help a little bit more as well. Next, we're going to go ahead and pull the A-pillar cover off on the passenger side. So you're going to need a pick to pull the little cover pieces off, and then a 10mm socket to go ahead and get the bolts that are holding it in place. And in this case, using something like an impact driver is probably going to speed things up for you. So I highly recommend the impact driver for disassembly of all these different components. Now, before the next step, we're going to go ahead and jump in and take a look at the brackets that come with this mpower interior light bar. Now, we're taking a look at the workbench here. We've got two brackets for each side. One is an interior bracket and one is an outer bracket, or an inside and an outside. And we're going to be mounting these brackets between the visor pivot or the visor stay and the headliner. So the outer brackets here, those are going to be for your visor pivots. That'll be that outermost section of your sun visor. And then the inner brackets, those are going to be at the visor stays. That's basically where the visor clips in when you're storing it out of the way. So we're going to do a little bit more disassembly here. We're going to start by loosening up the visors, and there are a couple of screws that we're going to need to do this. Now, for the outer one, there's a cover that we need to move out of place. So we're going to start by pulling that cover on the clip kind of towards the windshield, and it will pop loose and it'll just kind of slide its way down the visor. And you're going to see that under there is a 7mm nut. So we're going to loosen that up using a 7mm socket. And again, I'm going to go ahead and use an impact driver, but if you don't have an impact driver, you could always use something like a ratchet in this case. Now, the next step is basically we're going to take these all off one at a time and put the brackets in between these clips and the headliner. So starting in this case with the inner clip, we're going to go ahead and completely take that 7mm bolt out, drop the clip completely. I'm going to go ahead and slide the bracket over the clip and then just kind of put it back into place. And I'm just going to put it into place loose. And then I'm going to repeat this process for the outer one on the passenger side as well, doing the exact same thing. Now, the outer bracket is a little bit more difficult to work with on this particular vehicle. It does have like a little hook on there, and you'll see it as you take it apart. You kind of have to rotate it into place. Now, that gets repeated on the other side, but I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to removing this center trim cover that sits just above the rearview mirror. This is pretty easy to do. Just grab it with your hand, one side only, and you're going to just kind of pull it down, and you'll feel it kind of pop the clip, and then repeat that on the other side of it. And then the whole thing just gets pulled right out of the way. Now, we got a couple more prep steps that we need to do. And the first one, and probably one of the most important steps of installing one of these interior mpower light bars, is we need to make sure that if you have any oil change stickers, they are moved out of the way. So we're going to go ahead and take this oil change sticker, just move it down so it's out of the way for installation, and we can always replace it, afterwards. And then following that, we want to make sure that we clean the glass. That's the other really important step. If you don't clean the glass, you're going to find that you have smudges and stuff like that, and it's really going to show once you turn those lights on. So you want to make sure that you get those really nice and clean. And just keep in mind, if you do have tint in this area, make sure that the glass cleaner is ammonia-free and rated for tint. Okay, so now let's go back to the bench and let's start assembling the rest of the light bar. So here you can see we've got the light bar just kind of laying out on the bench. It consists of two shrouds, a wire between the two shrouds, and then we've got a harness coming out the passenger side. And that harness is further broken down into 4 wires: red, green, white, and black. So the next step is to go ahead and put the gasket. There's a rubber gasket that gets installed on the leading edge of the light bar. And we provide a kind of a thick or a fat gasket, and then a thin gasket or a small gasket, whichever you want to look at it. And sometimes one will work better than the other, but I find in most cases just going with the thick gasket, that's probably going to be your best bet. And we're just going to apply that across the front edge of the light assembly, just kind of pushing it in place. And then once we get from one end to the other, we're going to use a set of cutters to basically cut the leftover pieces. And you're going to need a set of cutters that have the ability to cut through steel because this is a steel reinforced gasket. Now, in order to get that gasket to sit all the way down, I find this done easiest by taking the whole light assembly and kind of pushing it into something flat and rocking it back and forth. That'll kind of work it all the way down so it does follow the radius of the shroud itself. So the next step is to go ahead and install the foam gasket just behind the rubber gasket. And what this foam gasket does is it acts like as a filter, and it will filter out any stray light that might be coming off the reflectors. And the light we're looking at specifically is the light that's hitting the windshield and reflecting down onto the dashboard. So that's really what this gasket's doing. And we want to make sure that we just kind of follow that from one side to the other. Now, the adhesive that's on the back side of this gasket is incredibly tacky. So if you do need to pick it up and reapply it in any place, make sure you get it as close to the shroud, or you kind of grab it as close to the shroud as possible so you can kind of grab that sticky edge as well. And then you can kind of move it around as needed. But if you just use the shroud or the gasket that we put on in the previous step as a guide, that's going to pretty much get you there. So the next step is to go ahead and put the light into place. And this is done fairly easily just by taking the light and kind of sliding it up the windshield and just above the brackets that you put on in one of the previous steps. And you'll notice that the brackets have like a hole in the bottom that lines up with a threaded hole in the shroud. And we're just going to go ahead and insert one of the screws with the star washer into each of those holes. But don't tighten it just yet. When it comes to tightening this down, you really want to kind of keep forward and upward pressure on everything. And then I find it best that if you tighten the screws that you put into the brackets or through the brackets into the shroud, tighten those first, and then come back and grab that 7mm socket that we had earlier and tighten down the remaining bolts along the top there where the visor's at. And what you'll find is by going in that order, it usually gives you a little bit of preload against the windshield. And then as you tighten those two 7mm screws down that are in the visor clip area, that kind of just finishes that preload for you. Okay, so once you've got both sides in place, that little cover above the mirror, we're going to take that excess wire that's, the jumper wire from one shroud to the other. We're going to kind of just tuck it up into the headliner, and you can also pull that area down to kind of get it up a little bit further. Once you've got that up and out of the way, go ahead and take the cover that we took off earlier and just pop it back into place. It just uses those couple clips to hold it. All right, so now it's the step where we start running wires. And really what we're going to be doing with this vehicle is we're going to be running the wires out into the engine compartment area. So here you can see I'm running the wire down the A-pillar, passing it into that side panel area. And once I've got that dropped all the way down, we're going to want to make sure that there's a little bit of slack for like a service loop. So if you ever have to take the light bar out, for a windshield replacement or something like that. And then we're going to zip tie that all into place. And you can see I'm zip tying it here to the wiring that's already in that area. Okay, and then at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put the A-pillar cover back into place. And so again, I'm using the 10mm socket as well as my impact. Now, I'm not going to go crazy tight with this. Anytime you're using an impact and you're tightening, please pay special attention to how tight you're going with some of the screws and the bolts. You don't ever want to over tighten something or strip something out. And also always make sure that you're threaded a couple turns before pulling the trigger on your impact gun. Now, as far as running the wire through the firewall, that's going to depend on your vehicle and what accessories are already installed. But we did find that there is a boot on the passenger side just behind this battery box. Hopping back into the vehicle, I'm going to go ahead and just put all these panels back into place, and they kind of all just pop into place. And then it's just a matter of getting the weather stripping back into place and then throwing on that final sill plate cover that's on the rocker area. All right, so looking at this diagram, at the top of the diagram, we have the mpower interior light bar. And coming down the right side of the diagram, representing the passenger side, is our wiring harness. Now that wiring harness breaks out into 4 wires. We've got the red wire. That's going to get connected to a fuse, and it's going to connect from there to your power source. The black wire is going to go ahead and just connect to a ground source. Now, the other 2 wires are your trigger wires, basically. They're going to be what turns the light on. So as long as the light has power and ground, those 2 wires are what's going to activate the different colors. So looking at the white wire, that is your trigger wire for your white light. That's going to get hooked up to a switch, and that switch is going to get connected to a power source or likely an ignition source. And then the green wire is the exact same thing, but it's going to be for the amber colored lights. So you're going to go ahead and run that through a switch and then to either a power source or an ignition source. And that's basically to tell it to turn on the amber lights. So back to the installation. Here I am. I'm going ahead and making that connection for the ground, and I'm doing that right here on the inside of the fender, just behind the battery here on the passenger side. Now, all that's left at this point for me is to go ahead and make my connections to the vehicle. And I did luck out on this installation. We did use the upfitter switches as part of this Ford F250. And the upfitter switches do provide us fused circuits for our trigger wires as well as our red wire for power. So all three of those connections were made right here next to the battery. So now it's just a matter of testing the lights out. Here you can see we're triggering the white lights. And here we are triggering the amber lights. Now, once you've tested it, we're pretty much done. We've already got everything put back together. So here's a quick image showing what the lights look like at night installed on the vehicle.